It was this time last week, Saturday morning in the early hours, that there was a surprise coordinated attack in Mali from Islamist a group called JNIM, linked to al-qaeda, and also a separatist group in the north. Now, for the last week, we've seen a fight back of sorts from the regime in control of the country, and also supported by Russian mercenaries. But two cities in the north have been taken. There have been surrenders by both the Russians and the Malian military. And right now there's a battle for Bamako. There is an apparent attempt for a complete blockade of all goods going in and out of the capital. Let's try and get a sense of what's been going on this week. We spoke right at the start of the week, when this was starting to happen, to Beverley Ochieng, who is a specialist in West Africa and political risk analysis at Control Risk, which advises governments and companies on security risks. She's in Dakar. Let's catch up again. Good to see you tonight. Welcome back to France 24, Beverley. Let's start with your understanding of where the situation sits in terms of the advance of JNIM and what territory they've managed to acquire, along with a separatist group, in the course of 7 days.
Yes, I mean, it's been a week since we spoke about that siege that had happened last Saturday, and there has been some progress in the northern region where there's more coordination between Janim and the Tuareg separatists from the FLA. As of this weekend, they had taken a few more bases. There was Tessalik, there's Agalhawk. These are strongholds of the Tuareg separatists, and they're looking to push out government forces. There have been conflicting reports, of course, over the withdrawal of other Russian paramilitaries in other parts of the north. They're also sharing a lot of video footage of their own, demonstrating that they are actively fighting against both Janim as well as the wider insurgency in the country. So this is still something that is developing for some time. Government control is something that the military government really wants to assert. So they are actively also fighting back, both in the northern regions, but also in the central regions where some military bases have been contested with Janim.
Tell us more about Janim, because one thing that's worth saying, the separatist group that have been fighting for independence in the north, this has been ongoing, this political fight, for a number of years. And these two their alliances together are merely for each other's cause. They're not sharing ideologies. And now you have a situation with JNIM, I believe, sending leaflets, information to civilians outside Bamako, saying that they want to see Sharia law. They want to basically civilians to be on side. Try and give us an idea, if you can, Beverley, of do we know how big the group JNIM is and what sort of military warfare, weaponry, machinery that they have?
Oh, yes. I mean, Janim came out of the emergence of 4 groups in 2017, and they have been active in Mali, neighboring Burkina Faso, as well as in Niger. They're led by a Tuareg member, Iyad Ghali, who's from the north region of Kidal, and there's also the deputy leader, Amadou Koufa, who's from the central region. So they do rely a lot on their own communal strongholds for recruitment over the years. They tap on marginalization, grievances around government presence, but also religious ideology. Sometimes they do proselytizing in certain places where they are trying to establish presence, but they're also responsible for years of violence in the region, targeting both civilians as well as security forces. They have long opposed successive governments. Some of their conditions, for instance, for dialogue with governments before were that Sharia law should be imposed. And they have had experiments of that, especially in the central region, where they impose their presence. They call for communities who tend to be very secular from other groups and other religions to adhere to their version of Sharia. And in many instances, this is a coercion and a violent strategy. They're now trying to push for this government to leave, and they're building coalitions where it's convenient for them, because beyond their allegiance to al-Qaeda, they're quite pragmatic. Their statements are increasingly political. They tap into the issues around the prolonged transition. Mali has been in military rule since 2020. There's concerns about civic freedoms. And ironically, despite the fact that they are also responsible for human rights abuses, they accuse the government of the same, and they want to try and drive an uprising. But their legitimacy and their political, hold, especially in areas where they're in the south, in particular of Mali, that is quite marginal. So they're trying to really push through messaging and through alliances.
And are these both kind of militia fighters, both of JNIM and this Tuareg separatist group, the Azawad Liberation Front, are they fighting together? And I ask that because if we're hearing about Kidal being taken, for example, and with that, you would assume that that's what both are now in control of these cities. You say Tessalik as well?
Yes, I mean, so in the northern part of Mali, yes, the two of them are leaning on each other to be able to fight. And you did ask a question about, weapons and capabilities.
Yeah.
They have thousands of fighters. In terms of the FLA, at least what is known as anything from 5,000, but they are able to adapt themselves because there's quite a bit of support within the north, and they have been actively calling for people to take up arms ever since the peace deal between them and the government collapsed in 2023, 2024. With Janim, it's a much bigger number in terms of across the region. They do have flexibility to move around depending on where they want to put pressure. So when the fuel blockade in Mali began, they were moving militants from neighboring Burkina Faso to put pressure on the southern regions. Sometimes they move back to the other territory. There's a flexibility in terms of that dynamics. Where they get their weapons from, the majority is from raiding security forces, especially over the years within the region. So being able to retain that, they do show that in some of their propaganda. They are involved in lots of illicit activities, whether it's artisanal mining, which allows them to then make some means of income to then purchase weapons. It could be on the black market, through the border areas, raiding militaries, a combination of things. When the withdrawal in the northern bases was taking place, there were some reports that Russian paramilitaries agreed to leave if they gave the FLA some of their weapons. So these may continue to be used in the current confrontations with the army.
That's very interesting because particularly in Tessalit, which you mentioned, which is very close to the Algerian border, there was a so-called super base there, wasn't there? So one assumes, given what you've said, that the rich pickings of war would have been left to them to some extent. Let's talk about, you talked about the Russians, and we talked about last week the killing of the defense minister, Sadio Kamara, who they called him, his nickname was Mr. Russia, wasn't it? That he was the kind of second in command really within the regime. He's the key person that brought Russia in terms of its mercenaries. Tell me about your understanding is of the relative strength and weakness now of the mercenaries, how many there are right now, and what the dynamic is.
Well, yes, I mean, when Kamara brought in the Wagner group, they were quite unfettered in their operations. They were considered to be quite heavy-handed. There were the allegations of what happened in the central region of Mura, which was alleged to be a massacre of civilians. There were other alleged atrocities taking place as they were seizing areas in the north alongside the army, things that the Malian government consistently denied but had been documented by various rights groups. When the Africa Corps took over because the Wagner group declared famously that they had left because their mission was finished, the Africa Corps is more affiliated with the Russian government. They are risk averse. They tend to wait for command and instructions. They were, in terms of local command in Mali, they still have the same structure and people. They moved in to this corps, but they wait for instructions from the government. It is directly now being overseen by the interim president, Assimi Goïta. In terms of their capacity, they rely a lot on the Russian government being able to bring in weapons and equipment, which has come in on several occasions through the port of Guinea by road into Bamako. This is then distributed from the air base in Senou, which is one area that the JNIM group has been targeting, especially the last couple of weeks and days, and distributed across the country. They have been setting up bases in different places, but in terms of their responsiveness, there's a bit more time in terms of negotiating with them to go to the front line. It's part of the reason things have picked up as they have comparatively in terms of militants being able to make massive incursions. But even as you mentioned the arrests earlier on, there are concerns that there may be some intelligence gaps within the Malian army, which then enabled for the attacks last Saturday to happen and with the ongoing siege to be taking place.
It's probably worth noting as well, the regime leader, the current ruler of Mali, Assimi Goïta, one of the first things he did, he disappeared, didn't he, for a few days. He wasn't seen in the aftermath, but then he went to the Russian ambassador first, it's reported, which gives you a sense of the importance of that relationship. And yet, if we go back 3 years or so, before the French troops left, I think collectively with the UN, the US and the French, around 17,000 troops supporting the Mali government. Are we down to, what, a few hundreds of troops now from Russian Africa Corps?
Yes, we have nearly 2,000 who are present in Mali, and then of course there's the Malian armed forces themselves. The capacity has been considerably stretched, especially with the campaign in the north and the fact that there were some gaps being left in the southern region, which then led to the kind of spread of the insurgency in the country over the last couple of years and what's happening now. There's still going to be some capacity issues. We did see the coalition, the Confederation of the Alliance of Sahel States, which is partly Burkina Faso and Niger as well, carrying out airstrikes. That joint force is still being established. Initially, there had been the G5 Sahel force, which became moribund and essentially collapsed. In terms of support for Mali, beyond that coordination from its neighboring countries and from Russia, there is a significant gap. The regional community has been fairly hesitant, considering the fact that Mali and its neighbors left ECOWAS. ECOWAS didn't really have counterinsurgency capacity, so it does bring a lot of challenges in terms of how does Mali push back the militants at the moment.
And a final thought, as things stand at the moment, trying to understand what's coming out of Bamako is quite difficult. But if we're told there is an ongoing attempt for a complete blockade in and out of the city, to try to understand that, try and help us in your understanding of what it's like for a civilian, for example, trying to leave and go in and out of the capital right now. Are there checkpoints set up, and are people free to leave and come and go?
Well, there's some routes that are still accessible, especially if you're going towards Nyono, if you're moving towards the airport or some parts of the south, there's some accessible roads. But if you're going towards the western region of Kai and trying to come in, it's difficult. JNIM said in its statement that people are allowed to leave the capital, but they're not allowed to come back inside. There will be days where goods and commodities are going to fluctuate. Yesterday, there were fuel trucks that came in, nearly 800 trucks, but that's not sufficient considering how much Mali used to receive on a daily basis, even before this blockade and even when the fuel embargo was taking place. The point of this siege is to put pressure on people so that they can in turn put pressure on the government to leave power. But it may take a bit of time. And we've seen, and I'm not a fan of this word, but resilience has been one of the big things since the blockade began in September, coming up with ways to deal with shortages of fuel and probably escalating that to other goods and services. But of course, it might be a dire situation, especially if JNIM starts to leverage some of the few open routes for closure to put more pressure on the government.
Beverley, it's always good to hear your analysis. Thank you so much for your time tonight. Beverley Ochieng, Senegalese capital Dakar, specialist in West Africa and political risk at Control Risks, which advises governments on security risk.